And we're live. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rira, and on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual event with Jeff Hobbs and Steve Lopez. Before we begin, I do have some quick guidelines for you all. This event includes a Q&A, and if you would like to ask a question to our guests, just use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, you can vote for it, and the question will make its way to the top of the list. And if you're considering supporting our bookstore tonight by purchasing a copy of Jeff Hobbs' new book, Show Them You're Good, you can click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen, and you'll be directed to our website where you can complete your purchase. And our next virtual event is scheduled for Thursday, August 20th at 6 p.m. Pacific time with Charles Rosenberg and Alexandra Petrie. Sorry about that. And you can learn more about our upcoming virtual events on our website as well as our social media. And with that said, I'm going to quickly introduce our guests and then pass the screen over to them. Jeff Hobbs graduated with a BA in English Language and Literature from Yale in 2002, where he was awarded the Willits and Meeker Prizes for his writing. He is the author of The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Pierce and The Tourist. And joining him tonight is Steve Lopez, a California native who has been an LA Times columnist since 2001. He has won more than a dozen National Journalism Awards for his reporting and column writing and is a three-time Pulitzer finalist for commentary. And he's also the author of The Soloist, which won the PEN USA Literary Award for nonfiction and became the subject of a DreamWorks movie by the same name. And with that said, enjoy the talk, everyone.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm sorry we can't see your faces and connect with you that way, but we'll try to connect in other ways. And Jeff and I are going to chat here for roughly a half hour or so, and then we're going to turn it loose to all of you to ask him some questions. And I think we're going to have a great evening. For those of you who are not yet sure, you're curious about the book, and that's why you've tuned in before you make your purchase. I just finished it this weekend, and it's a fabulous book, and I highly, highly recommend it. Not just is it a great book, but turns out to be, in some ways, maybe somewhat accidentally, a really timely book, given some of the things that have been in the news in recent weeks and months. And we'll get into that a little bit as we discuss this. Jeff and I have not met other than this virtual meeting. We don't live all that far apart from each other, but I've been getting to know him just a little bit, and I know a little more about him just from having read this great book. It's I mean, Jeff, you're totally immersed in this book, a fly on the wall in one of the most dreadful and exciting times in a teenager's life, senior year of high school. That's coupled with, the college application nightmare, and you're out to dinner with the boys and their families. You're at the mall with them on weekends. You're in their classrooms, and you're in their proms. It's a great idea. You spend time with students from Animo Pat Brown, which is in South LA, close to Watts and toward Compton, and some time with students at Beverly Hills High. So it's two different worlds, not all that far apart, maybe 20 miles physically. So where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, thank you, Steve. First, I just wanted to say, I haven't lived here as long as you, but in LA, but I've lived here a while, for 15 years, and a lot of those years I've spent reading your work in the Times, and LA is this kind of big, beautiful, angry, poignant mashup of a city, and it's hard to get around. And your work, whether you're hiking in the San Gabriels or at a school in Pacoima or a barbershop in Echo Park, you connect us to the city, and I'm grateful, and I'm so glad to be here with you.
I appreciate that.
And yeah, and that's also a lot of what this book sort of meant to me. As far as the idea, so I wrote this book called The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace a number of years ago. And when it came out, something really terrifying happened, which is that schools began asking me to come visit and speak. And you can already tell I was not meant to speak in public or really speak at all. So I was kind of fretting about it. My wife kicked me in the butt and said, it's not an obligation to go to these schools. It's a privilege, and just say yes and get yourself there. And so I did.
Good for her.
Oh, yeah. Well, all around the country, there was something, where there was a big auditorium with, many hundreds of people, or a classroom with 3 or 4 people. There was something about Rob, who was a friend of mine, something about his story that compelled young people, young men in particular, to sort of share fragments of their own stories. And that was really meaningful for me. And I kind of carried that home, whether it was at, Harvard or a juvenile hall in Ohio. And, I just started wondering if there was some way to kind of share that on the ground experience and not drape it over a device like sports say. Maybe just be with some people that age and see what it looks like and feels like to be 17 years old. And then my wife, who, was very gung-ho, started thinking I'd lost my gourd. But she still does, probably. But anyway, that's sort of where it began.
Well, you mentioned The Short Tragic Life, Robert Peace, and I don't want to deter you from this book, but there are some, I don't know, in your mind, are there some connections that in some ways, some parallels? I mean, both these books are in many ways about race, class, privilege, expectations. And I wonder if you would mind, for those who did not read that book, giving us a brief summary of it, because it's quite a powerful story. And that was a hugely successful bestseller. So tell us a little bit about that book and whether you see a bridge between that one and this.
Sure. And thanks for asking. Briefly, that, my roommate from college at Yale, a really close friend, died when we were 30. He died violently. He'd grown up the hard way in Newark, New Jersey, and his father was in prison, and his mother worked really hard for not much money, and he worked hard, and he went to Yale, and seemed like things were, going to move in a straight line for him, and they didn't. And again, I'll be brief, but it didn't end well, and it's a long story. I certainly didn't intend to write a book or I didn't think many people would read that book, but it was really kind of meaningful.
Did you you attended that funeral, and the way you knew him was that you were his roommate at Yale, I think, with 2 others, 4 of you all together, if I'm not mistaken. And when you stayed in touch with him after graduating, but when you found out that he had died, you attended the funeral. It seems I've read interviews with you where being at that funeral was quite a difficult and moving experience for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never been to a funeral like that before, and I'd never experienced that particular kind of grief before. And it was people from all over the world, actually, amid the towering grief, trying to kind of celebrate him and tell those stories about loyalty and little quirks and friendship. And, that's one of the bridges maybe that you asked about is male friendship and male vulnerability. A lot of people ask me as I've worked on Show Them You're Good, kind of, why are you writing about boys? And I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I think girls are really interesting, and I'm married to one and I'm raising one. But one thing is I thought having girls and boys together in a room might not make for the most authentic conversations. And another thing has to do with, like I said, kind of what's still a machismo culture. I think there's a lot of effort to make societal effort to, listen to boys more and be more sensitive. And, there's a lot of books about how to raise sensitive boys. But, for a kid, still, if someone pushes you at recess, you're not supposed to cry. You're definitely not supposed to tell the teacher. And there's a kid in the book, Tio, who his sophomore year in high school, his father struggled with alcoholism very terribly, went on basically a year-long bender that wasn't physically abusive, but just deep emotional trauma. And Tio's grades at school that he had worked very hard to get to a certain level fell. And this is at Animo Pep Brown in South LA. And, it's a school where, there's not a ton of counselors, but it's a school where, the teachers and they care. And, there's a period every day devoted to connecting with a teacher and working on things. And so during that year, everyone's asking him, is everything all right? What's going on with your grades? And he wouldn't mention what was going on at home. He'd just say, I'm all good. Got a little lazy. Like, I'll bring him back up. And that's hard. It's important. And still to this day, when that topic comes up, he'll say, like, yeah, no big deal. It was just something that happened. I got through it. And, Rob Peace, that was his mantra. It's all good. I'm all good. And when someone projects that, it's easy to believe it.
Yeah, Tio is one of my favorite characters. You find yourself very early on in this book rooting for all of them. I mean, there's such a rooting interest for readers because each student, and it's very personal. I mean, they really, really let you into their lives and their differences with their parents. And, they're at that age where they're trying to break free and the parents are still trying to, not give them too much free reign. And they're very honest with you, it seems, about their feelings and their passions, their hopes, their fears. And you're rooting for them to get what they want because they're all in one way or another really dealing with a lot and or working really hard and just trying to make sense of the world. I love that about the book. I want to get back, though, to how did you end up with Animo Pat Brown and Beverly Hills High? And was it, did you think this story is best told if it's two really different socioeconomic, racial groups? They're in the same city, but their life experiences are vastly different. Is this book in part about contrasts?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, it's interesting to me. So I had this idea. I began kind of reaching out to schools all over Los Angeles, jumping through hoops, making presentations for about a full year. And I learned that no principal in his right mind or her right mind, wants a writer kind of nosing around their school, and for good reasons. I mean, schools, they get dinged a lot, but these two schools, I had visited each of them, to do book groups, and I reached out to some wonderful teachers that I knew, and they kind of vouched for me, and that's how they were okay with it. And so in kind of first meeting the boys, which, was awkward because I'm an awkward person. And sort of my line, the first meeting is, I don't want you to feel like you're representing your neighborhood or your race or your class. I just want you to represent yourselves. And, the best thing and the worst thing about teenagers is that they see through that stuff pretty quick. And, so, clearly I'm hanging out at a school in one of the richest districts in the country and a school in one of the poorest. And that wasn't an arbitrary choice. There is contrast that I'm looking for, but there's also a lot of commonality to passage in life and applying to
for sure
college and sort of this first big contest of their lives, and romance and family, and just figuring out that the world is a messy place that doesn't really contain straight lines from, and so that's kind of where we started, and they got pretty real pretty fast.
They were. You felt like you put them at ease enough early on that they were just themselves. And another thing is that
I also brought food, which I think was pretty.
What's that?
I brought food as well, which helped.
Oh, you bribed? Or did you bribe them?
A lot of.
But you didn't judge. You didn't judge them. You just let them find their way and understand themselves. And you chronicled it so beautifully and passionately. And you didn't need to preach. You must at some point have had such faith in the power of the story that you knew the commentary would be carried by their experiences and you didn't need to step in. Was that a consideration for you, that you were there and, witnessed all of this, but give them their space and just tell their stories rather than get in the way of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the goal. And you know this from your work. You sort of go where you're drawn and you don't know who you're going to meet or what you're going to see or how they're going to receive you. And, the goal is always to undermine presumptions, and also to, find what's absolutely unique, what makes each kid himself, those details. Owen and, metabolizing his mother's chronic illness that leaves her bedridden. And I've talked about Tio and, Carlos is applying to DACA and the Ivy League at the same time. But, and that in itself is kind of a trope. You can read those stories in the newspaper, but, you wouldn't expect in that story that his older brother is already in the Ivy League. So, he's dealing with that process, and he's also in his brother's shadow, and it's so complicated, and all those details and music, but and then you're looking for what if you put that together, what becomes universal belongings and family and resilience is a big thing, and school and in life, and trying to fit those two pieces of the work together. Again, you know this better than me, and you do it better than me. But that work is very clumsy and very hard, and it's also the work that it's the fun part.
There's another element with the student you described who's applying to the Ivy League schools at the same time he's waiting to hear on his DOC application. Donald Trump is becoming president. It's the end of the campaign, and then he's elected. And one mom in particular is living in dread at what this might mean for them. I mean, that's another thing that each of these students dealt with, some in more personal and intense ways than others, but there were differences between how it was dealt with at the two schools.
For sure. And, I started visiting the schools in August of 2016, when, a lot of people and polls, I guess, were predicting a certain outcome to the election that obviously was wrong. I really didn't want to make it about that, but that point in time for everybody was about that. And so at Animo Pep Brown, which I'll call it APP, the school's almost 100% Latino students. And I remember the night of the election, I'd been planning to go the next day and sort of see what it was like there. And one of the teachers emailed me and said, maybe, don't come tomorrow. It's once the results were in, said it's going to be probably pretty depressing. And then he emailed a few minutes later and said, actually, come, this is important. And I went, and the next day, the atmosphere was almost kind of casual, like a little lethargic. And, the talk was about, the long arc of justice and the next day, 2 days after the election, is when sort of the anger came out. But, I remember a teacher voiced this to me, but the boys sort of voiced it as well in their own ways. Their kind of ethos for that year turned, and it became how to not be afraid and kind of own their own voices. And so meanwhile, across town, I'm in Beverly Hills High School. LA, if you read the media, it feels like a very liberal bubble and a sanctuary city, but it's not necessarily. And in Beverly Hills, there's a pretty large conservative presence because there's a pretty large amount of money. So that's something the boys contended with in school. And I would just say what was neat about it was, being at a table with 7 people who could talk about it and, disagree and get tense, but kind of listen at the same time, like not make everything moral and kind of have these really far-reaching conversations that I was not observing among adults during that time.
I thought you integrated the election perfectly into this. It didn't take over, but it nicely complemented what you were doing. I wanted to ask you, did anybody, it wasn't quite a year, I don't think. It was, 9 or 10 months. Did anybody ever say, okay, enough already, Jeff? Would you get the hell out of here now? We don't want you to come to dinner. We don't want you to ask any more questions. Or were you even asking questions? Were you just like, in on their conversations? You must have interviewed the kids at length, because you learned so much about who they were and were able to articulate that with their help. But did anybody ever say, why the heck did I agree to let you into my life like this?
Well, maybe they were thinking that at points. I should explain. So, I went to football games and plays, and you mentioned proms and dances and classes. I did not go to like unsanctioned parties on the weekends.
You didn't go on a date with them.
I was invited. I didn't want to dumb the place down. But anyway, I did all that. But the sort of the meat of the whole book is these sort of round table conversations we would have at each school once a week after school, where we just had our own space, no teachers. And I would go in with prompts, current events or stuff happening in school. But for the most part, they just kind of talked to each other. I don't know if it was therapeutic, but they did keep coming back, and I wasn't making them.
Yeah, I'm sure that it was.
I did bring food.
I'm sure that it was. I also saw you quoted somewhere, and somebody did ask, why did you do boys and not girls? And you said some people might think it was not quite appropriate for an older man to be hanging out with teenage girls.
Thought maybe their parents wouldn't.
I wanted to ask you, and then folks, just a little bit longer here, and then we'll bring you into this. But I wanted to ask. I mean, it's 4 students, 2 from each school, are the focus, but several others at each school make the cut here. I think Mark Bowden, in his rave review on the jacket of this book, Mark Bowden of Black Hawk Down, who, by the way, Jeff, this is sat near me and Buzz Bissinger when we were at the Philadelphia Inquirer many years ago. So I know those guys back from my Philadelphia reporting days. But so it's about 4 kids primarily, but several are included along with the occasional teacher or counselor, parents. But then in your acknowledgments, I want to read this if I can see here. Thank you equally to Noah, Ryan, Ivan, Victor, and John. And you explain in this acknowledgement that not everybody that you spent time with made it into this book. That must have been heartbreaking to go through all of this and have to, for space considerations or narrative considerations, leave some of them out of it. And what was it about those that you stuck with as the core of the book? Did you just find that they had more compelling stories, or they were better contrasts off of, say, the ones that, from South LA to those at Beverly Hills? So that must have been a tough part of the process, is to find the right kids and then decide which ones you had to let go of.
Yeah, that was terrible, what you mentioned, because like I said, they came every week for these, we'd usually sit around 2 hours, but sometimes 3 or even 4 hours if we were really talking. And, those guys had tremendously compelling stories, and I really admire them. And, so when it came to sort of narrative and space and balance, I had written a draft with all of them in that was, 100 some pages longer, and it didn't work. So yeah, you feel, I don't know, like the football coach who has to cut the kid he really likes, who works hard, but and it wasn't necessarily, some stories were more compelling than others. Certainly some boys are better storytellers than others, and some are more introverted, and I have a real soft spot for introverts, and they're in the book as well. But it wasn't a really clean decision. It had to do with, again, the theme of male friendship, and there's a kid, John, who was sort of manically involved with every extracurricular activity in the school, and because of that, he kind of intersected with all these different areas that were fun to get into. So.
And the students in many ways, they do despise stereotypes in some cases. You've got from South LA kids who are in contention to attend some of the best universities in the country, and at Beverly Hills High, you've got some students who are not at all wealthy, and in some ways are kind of struggling, and not expecting necessarily to get into some of the best schools in the country, or so-called best schools. I was reminded a bit of The Slums of Beverly Hills, the movie about the family moving into Beverly Hills, the cheapest apartment, and to attend the public schools. But these students do in some ways defy stereotypes, I think. I wanted to, because we need to wrap it up and get to the questions here. I read an interview in which you said that with The Short Tragic Life of Robert Peace, you really wrestled with, as anybody does who writes anything of any length or import, why am I doing this? What is the point of it? I think maybe I'm not sure if I'm mixing things up here, but our mutual friend and agent, David Black, who often has some of the best editorial advice. He's our agent, but I think he's a great editor. Helps ground you. And I wanted to ask you, did you ask yourself that, or David that, writing this book, what is the point? And what is the point doesn't mean maybe I shouldn't be writing this. It's still that you're wrestling with how do you frame it and how do you best tell a story that connects. So did you consider that process and that idea in both books? What is the point of this, and what do I want people to take from it?
I did, but again, it's not a clean process. With Rob, I mean, he was my friend, and it started just kind of maybe gathering some anecdotes that spoke to his life and not just his death. I mean, I call that a eulogy that got out of hand, really out of hand. And, I struggle a lot. What would Rob think about that? Because he was a pretty private person, and, he would most likely kick my ass. But then I think he would sort of see, like I mentioned, these boys in schools all around, sharing their own feelings, and I think he'd be pretty proud of that. With this one, there wasn't really a point or an agenda, and the boys are not famous, and I living in LA where the weather's very nice. There's beaches. There's from 30,000 feet, it looks very mellow, but on the ground, it's really fast, and people are just trying to get to the next place. Whether physically, do I take Vermont or Western to get where I need to go, or work, like what this is my next client, this is the next project I'm doing, and it's all fast, and books are not fast. And so, over the years at kids' birthday parties or whatnot, you meet people, and they'd say, I heard you're doing something about schools. Like, what's that about? And I'd say, I don't really like to talk about my work because I don't like people to be bored. But, I'd say I'm just sort of hanging out at schools, like you said, kids applying to college. And they say, so you're writing about college applications and there's so much, inequity and it's such a broken system. And I'd say, it is, but, everyone's going through it and different spaces. And they say, well, you're writing about society and, rich and poor and how unfair it is. And I'd say there's unfairness and that's important. But yeah, I'm just hanging out in schools, really. And then we changed the subject. So I struggled with the point, but once we finished, I would still hang out with the boys over the years. We would get together, and they're not boys anymore. They're young men, and talk back over that year. And what we always came back to was the notion of unknowns in life. You go to school, no matter where you live, you pretty much for 12 years know what is going to happen between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. every day, and then you turn 17 and suddenly you don't know where you're going to be in a year or how you're going to pay for it or who you're going to be with or, whether you're going to be happy or miserable and whether you've made the right decisions and whether that pub quiz and English class is going to really mess you up down the road. Those unknowns, I think, are the source of a lot of the stress and the, anxiety and the warped logic that, we tend to associate with teenagers. But it's also the source of, their triumph and their friendships and their connections and their wonder. And so, these are the traits that you hope to take with you, that you hope your children will take with them. And so the point was not really to recreate those feelings. That's disingenuous. And I played adult flag football for 10 years trying to recreate some things, and all I have is bad back. But we kind of maybe through these pretty, pretty meaningful stories, maybe retrieve it, that time of life, and I think that's all to the good.
One last quick thing: you're a dad, you're a parent. You saw a lot of parenting over that year. Do you think you've been impacted in any way as a parent by watching how at such a critical juncture of those lives, those young men were parented and related to their parents in good ways and bad? What'd you learn about being a dad from researching the book?
I mean, so many specific moments, but to be concise, I would say part of the passage all around all these different kids who had very different relationships with their parents and very different degrees of support from their parents, was realizing that so much of the friction that exists between parents and children comes from love. It was touching watching kids go through that.
Well, Jeff, this was just I think a wonderful contribution to the library of books on Los Angeles. It gives me a new understanding and appreciation. I frequently thought, why didn't I think about that as a column idea, as a book idea? I thought that this was the book was just an inspiration, and so well done. I thank you for it, and I know that your readers will appreciate it. And speaking of, I believe we're ready now to field some questions.
Thank you again so much, Steve. Again, it's really pretty special for me to be here with you. And I think I can sort of field some questions. Well, the first is, are you still in contact with the boys? Yeah, very much so. I mean, part of the real difficulty of this kind of work is you get really close in a very intimate day-to-day relationship, and then as Steve and I talked about, that ends at a certain point, and it's sad when it ends, and you sort of pull away and work. But we have kept up, and it's been kind of fun watching them. And I should say that they all read the book before, while I was still editing it, which is probably considered bad journalism. But I thought in this particular project, it was respectful, and it was really.
How were
helpful.
the reviews?
How
were the reviews?
They made some points in places, but what was really fun about that was them a couple of years removed from high school, looking back on the things they did and said in high school, which on one level was very recent, and on another was just eons in the past. And this effort they made to not redact or kind of edit those moments in their lives through their newfound, more worldly perspectives, say, and they got a real kick out of it, I think. So what were the parents' reactions to you interviewing their children, and what did you learn as a parent writing this book? Well, you sort of already asked the second part. Their reactions were, they all had to sign kind of a form at the beginning, and I'm not sure how that form was presented, if it was just something your kid brings home and you sign without reading it, or if how many people actually kind of weighed what that would mean. But over time, everyone really had me into their homes, and there were a couple parents who I found really intimidating. I mean, one kid's father in Beverly Hills is a pretty insanely successful TV creator, and also a very tall man, and a very kind of quiet and imposing man. So I was always nervous running into him, and writing about his son. And at one point we were in their home, and I was kind of blabbering to him about thank you, and I hope kind of everything's cool. And he just said, if it's Owen's truth, put it down. Owen really wanted to do this. And, a number of the parents did not speak English, which, so it was kind of translated through their sons, which again takes a lot of effort on their part, and a lot of courage putting themselves forward. So I was really grateful to the parents, and they helped with some editing as well. I was seeing a mom the other day dropping off a book, and she said, I was not wearing a red blouse that day. I was wearing polka dot. How do you balance life and writing, raising 2 kids, and being a husband, and carving out enough time to work and research? That's a really nice question. Probably better for my wife, at least the husband part. But I just get up really early, like 4, to get some work done before the day starts, when it's kind of quiet and dark and cold. But thanks for asking that, Ken Nolan. What was the hardest part about writing this book? I think I'll do maybe this question and then one more. The hardest part of writing the book, I mean, one of the hardest parts, same in Rob Peace, is kind of taking these humans who've just shared an awful lot with, this kind of awkward guy who knocks on their door sometimes, taking all that, and at a certain point you sort of have to edit it, and you have to cut things and leave things out, which is complicated for me anyway. Again, just because I admire these guys a lot. And then really the hardest part of the book, again, they're going through the college admissions process from, two very different platforms, and it's hard. You're told throughout your time in school that, if you have a dream, you can get it. Like, it's on you. It's kind of national ethos of self-determination. If you want to be an engineer, you can be an engineer. Just do the work, and you can make it happen. And that's a powerful motivator. And it's true until it's not true. And it wasn't true for everybody in this book. And not just college, just passages in life. And that was hard to be there for, and not be able to really do anything about. I'm thinking of a moment that has really stayed with me, and tiny little moment that it's in the book, but I didn't really dig into it because I think it would have been overwrought. But one of the students, like I said, it didn't work out the way he hoped it would, and the way he worked really, really hard to make happen. And it didn't. And this was in the spring of his senior year, and in the hallways, kids for whom it did work out, kids who got into the schools he wanted to get into, who maybe didn't get the grades he got, but there were other factors, and he was just. We were in the room, our little meeting, and he was really taking it hard, and he was sitting there and he was saying, I can't believe I worked that hard. I worked hard to get A's. I could have just gotten C's and still get into the school that I got into. Like, it was all a waste. I could have just been skateboarding that whole time. And he was sitting next to a boy for whom it had worked out spectacularly. And, that boy, they'd been friends since, third or fourth grade. And he looked at him and he knew not to say, any of those platitudes that, life is what you make of it, wherever you're going to school, like, it's going to be great. He knew not to say that. He just put his hand on the guy's shoulder, and they let their heads hang together for just a few seconds. But, that human contact was, I don't know, it stayed with me.
Hey, Jeff, it's a brutal process, isn't it? I mean, did you come away with any thoughts on, is there a better way to do this? And is part of it that we we've identified certain schools that signify and symbolize, oh, you made it or you didn't, because the young man that you're talking about went to a great school that I think most people would be proud and privileged to be able to attend, but it wasn't quite what he expected based on the status of other schools. Watching what this process did to these kids, in some ways it gets the best out of you, but it can be such a corrosive, poisonous process too.
For sure. And, my interest is not really in systems. I mean, I did a lot of research and there's a bit of that in the book. And full disclosure, my sister worked as an admissions officer for many years. So, I had that window as well. For me, what was interesting specifically about the college admissions process, or sweepstakes, whatever you want to call it, is, applying to college is an act of storytelling. There's all these forms and finances, and one college asked for like a hashtag describing yourself, and some kids wrote like "Go Dodgers," some kids, one kid wrote "undocumented" and proud. But you're spending 6 months, kind of putting together the story of your life and projecting that out there alongside, if you're applying to the UCs or Cal States, hundreds of thousands of people, broader nationally, millions of people, and then these strangers are going to decide how your story measures against, someone else, and the sort of impact of that on self-worth can be tremendous, and then that's fun to watch, and like you said, it can be really corrosive when it doesn't go the way you want. But that's what resilience is, and resilience is kind of what school is about. And so I think I'll maybe hand it back to Vroman's now. I'm sorry I didn't get to all that.
I think we have time for one more question, if you would like to browse through and see if there's one you can quickly answer.
What are some unique struggles you believe high school boys, it scrolled down. What are some unique struggles you believe high school boys are grappling with now compared to a decade ago? And thanks, that's a really nice question. I can't really speak for a decade ago because I went to high school 2 decades ago. But, I can speak to that, maybe my own experience. And as far as struggles, I think with all the, connections and social media, I don't really want to talk about social media, but I found the boys to be just really more connected, read a lot more, more kind of connected to themselves. And that can be a struggle, I think. Just, I'm thinking of a boy, just because, again, everything's always kind of stacking. And there's, these obsessions with rankings. And so I'll try to make it a a short story. But there was a boy. He's not a main character in the book, but his story's there. The reason he's not a main character is because I was worried that might put him in danger. This boy was born into a family that became toxic, and there was abuse on the part of the father, and that led to a mother and her 3 children running away in the middle of the night. This boy spent his childhood in children's welfare and without money, and sort of moving up and down small apartments along the freeways of South Los Angeles. And his father was wealthy enough and vindictive enough to, actively try to ruin them. And he was afraid to go to the grocery store because he was terrified of running into him. And, finally, right before high school, they got to Beverly Hills. They got a small apartment. They got freed legally, and they moved there so that they could go to Beverly Hills High School. So he walks in. It's a big, beautiful building. He doesn't know anyone. He's 14 years old, and he decides, I'm going to make the tennis team. I'm going to be an athlete. He's tall. He's got long arms. He's pretty good. And that's going to be his thing. He'll have built-in friends, and people in the hallways are going to admire him and just know that that's what he does. And then he didn't make the team. And how tough do you have to be to carry on from that, to not just join the drinking crowd or get C's, or just to, again, in this kind of morass of social media and just to figure out some other way you're going to be. I think I maybe answered the exact opposite question, as far as maybe it's not the differences and struggles, maybe it's the commonality, again, and resilience that I guess that's what's stayed with me. And I'm sorry to go long here. I really do appreciate this.
Oh, no problem. I think we're right on time. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Steve, for such a lovely talk. We really appreciate everyone's time and support of independent bookstores, especially during this strange time. The replay of this event will be available on this very same Crowdcast link if you would like to watch it again. Also, we'll have it re-uploaded on our YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that. And again, if you're considering supporting our bookstore by purchasing a copy of Show Them You're Good, just click on the green purchase button directly below. And congratulations again, Jeff, on your new book.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Steve. This was, as my son would say, an amazing life experience.
Pleasure is all mine. Congratulations on a great book.
All right. And have a good night, everyone. All right.